The missile warning didn't sound like it was supposed to. It wasn't the steady pulse of a search radar sweeping the sky. It wasn't the urgent scream of a surface-to-air lock. It was a single, sharp tone, and that meant something had already been fired. The Ukrainian MiG-29 pilot didn't see the launch. He didn't see a radar spike build. He didn't see a missile plume because there was no radar. At 6:12 local time, he was 35 kilometers from his release point, flying east at 900 kilometers per hour, just 50 meters above frozen Ukrainian fields. This was supposed to be a survivable corridor. Ground controllers had mapped it. Intelligence had cleared it. Friendly traffic had been grounded to make space. It was wrong. The approach had been textbook. Friendly rear areas first. Then the gray zone where control shifted by the hour. Above him, between 100 and 300 meters, reconnaissance drones from both sides monitored the front. Below him, at 20 to 50 meters, FPV strike drones hunted vehicles and troops in an endless robotic war. He was threading the gap between them, and something had just launched. He reacted instantly. Stick back. Throttle forward. Flares punched into the slipstream as G-forces crushed him into his seat. The MiG pitched up through 100 meters, then 150, then 200. He was trading invisibility for survival. No impact came. No explosion. Whatever had been tracking him lost lock in the flare cloud. But now he was exposed. At 300 meters, his radar warning receiver lit up. A Buk battery to the south was painting him. An S-300 somewhere to the east was searching. He had escaped one threat and climbed straight into another. Then he saw them, two shapes roughly 3 kilometers out, delta wings about 3-5 meters across, moving slowly, loitering, Giran 2 drones, the color drained from his face. In December, Russian forces had begun modifying Giran 2 reconnaissance drones. They strapped R-60 infrared air-to-air missiles beneath them. Surveillance platforms turned into ambush predators. Their purpose was simple: wait above low-altitude strike corridors and hunt aircraft exactly like his. The R-60 was infrared-guided, which meant his radar warning receiver could not detect the launch. The first missile hadn't been invisible by accident. It had been designed that way. The drones began turning toward him. If they carried more missiles, he was about to find out. He rolled hard and dove, dumping more flares. At 200 meters, he was still too high. The Buk radar was building a firing solution. Stay high and the Buk would fire. Go low and the drones would have a perfect shot at his engines. A white flash, second missile. He shoved the stick forward and dove for the deck, afterburner screaming, flares streaming behind him like a comet tail. The R-60 was an older missile, first-generation seeker. Distractible. At 40 meters, fence posts blurred past his canopy. His RWR showed the Buk still radiating but not launching. He had dropped below its engagement envelope. Above him, the missile chased flares that no longer belonged to his aircraft. The second R-60 detonated harmlessly. The Giran drones continued orbiting, out of ammunition, but not useless. They transmitted his position. He exhaled, alive and completely off course. The evasive maneuvers had pushed him north of the deconflicted corridor into airspace no one had cleared. His heading was wrong. His altitude was wrong. When he keyed the radio for a new vector, the reply came fragmented. Corridor compromised, working alternate. Then static, ground control sounded overwhelmed. The busiest battlefield on Earth was moving faster than they could track. He checked his instruments. The release point was still 22 kilometers east. The bridge was still standing. The mission was still valid. He turned east, and then he saw the swarm, FPV drones. A stream of them crossing his flight path roughly 200 meters ahead at his altitude. Small, fast, dark against gray sky. Russian strike drones heading west. Ukrainian interceptors heading east, or the reverse, it didn't matter. At 900 kilometers per hour, he was closing at 250 meters per second. There was no maneuver that solved this. He flew through them, above him, below him, around him. He wasn't even sure how many. By the time his brain registered movement, each drone was already behind him. This was the nightmare scenario, the one briefers warned about but had no solution for. The Picrosk sector had become the most drone-saturated airspace in human history. On a slow day, 20 FPVs per mile of frontage. Today was not slow. His N019 radar was useless. Designed for fighter-sized targets, not 30-centimeter drones with the radar cross-section of a hot dog. His infrared search and track system couldn't see cold plastic and lithium batteries. Every sensor in his cockpit belonged to a different war. Only his eyes mattered now, and they weren't fast enough. The radio crackled. Vector 090, heavy activity above 60 meters, stay below 50. He nudged down to 45 meters, power lines, cell towers, those weren't the worst danger. The real threat was nearly invisible, fiber optic cables. Russian operators had begun trailing hair-thin wires behind some FPVs. Photographers had captured them draped across ruins like spider silk. One into his intake could shred the compressor. He would never see it coming. Another broken transmission. Ukrainian interceptors active, airspace contested. Now his own side's drones were in the mix, chasing Russian FPVs, adding more chaos to already saturated skies. Ground control's picture was minutes old. At 900 kilometers per hour, minutes might as well be ancient history. Then a shadow crossed his peripheral vision. Too close. An FPV maybe 50 meters away. No time to react. It was gone before his muscles moved. The bridge was still 15 kilometers ahead. And every second he stayed in this altitude band was a dice roll against collision. He made a decision. He couldn't stay down here. There was only one way out, up, and climbing meant something far worse was waiting. And this time, it wouldn't miss. He pushed the throttle through the detent and into full afterburner. Raw fuel ignited in the exhaust. The MiG surged forward, acceleration climbing past 1,000 kilometers per hour. The drone swarm began to thin beneath him as he pulled back on the stick and started climbing. He was punching out of the swarm the only way he could, up, but climbing meant trading invisible threats for visible ones. At 500 meters, his radar warning receiver lit up. At 1,000 meters, the signal strengthened. At 2,000 meters, it was solid. A Russian Buk M3 battery had him. The fire dome tracking radar locked on, bathing his aircraft in continuous energy. That energy wasn't just watching him. It was calculating where he would be in 10 seconds. He kept climbing. This was no longer a standard strike run. He was setting up a toss bombing maneuver, a Cold War relic designed for nuclear-capable fighter bombers. The concept was simple: climb steeply, release at the top, let momentum carry the bombs forward while you dive away. It allowed an aircraft to strike a target without flying directly overhead. The textbooks assumed a permissive threat environment. Picrosk was not permissive. At 2,500 meters, the radar was still tracking. At 3,000 meters, it was building a firing solution. If the Buk fired now, he would have seconds. But breaking off meant flying back through the drone swarm with nothing accomplished. The bridge was still standing. Ground forces were still counting on him. 3,500 meters. His iPad display showed release parameters approaching. The math was tightening. The Buk radar was calculating intercept geometry. He was calculating escape geometry. Could he release the bombs and dive below the radar horizon before a 9M317M missile caught him? He was betting his life on that equation. 4,000 meters. The iPad flickered yellow, close enough. His thumb pressed weapons release. Two heavy thuds shook the airframe as the AASM Hammer bombs separated cleanly from their pylons. He didn't watch them fall. He was already moving. Stick forward. Roll inverted. Pull through a split test that would have failed him in peacetime flight school. The MiG's nose dropped toward the earth, trading altitude for survival. Behind him, the bombs, solid rocket motors ignited, accelerating them toward Mach 08. They began their 15-kilometer flight toward the eastern span of the Picrosk Bridge. The Buk fired. His RWR screamed the launch warning. Somewhere to the south, a 9M317M missile roared off its rail and accelerated to Mach 4 in seconds. He never saw it. His face was pointed at the earth. Altimeter unwinding, 3,500, 3,000, 2,500. The 9M317M was semi-active radar homing. It carried no independent radar. It chased reflected energy from the Fire Dome illuminator, the brightest radar return in the sky. If he could break that illumination, the missile would go blind. There was only one way to do that: drop below the radar horizon. The math was merciless. Missile speed, approximately 1,400 meters per second. Distance, roughly 8 kilometers. Time to impact, 6 seconds, maybe 7. Time to reach terrain masking altitude, 5 seconds, maybe 6. Margin, 1 second, maybe 2,000 meters. The airframe began buffeting, control surfaces strained as he pushed the dive angle close to structural limits. 1,500 meters, the missile was closing. 1,000 meters, individual trees were visible now. Buildings, frozen fields rushing up. At 600 meters, he began the pullout. Too early and the radar would still see him. Too late and he would hit the ground. G-forces crushed him into the seat, vision graying at the edges. He held the pull. At 200 meters, wings level, racing west at maximum dry power. His RWR showed the Fire Dome still searching. Then nothing. He had dropped below the radar horizon. The illumination beam no longer reached him. 3 seconds before impact, the 9M317M lost lock. Its guidance computer commanded a last-ditch climb. Proximity fuse armed. It found empty air. The warhead detonated roughly 300 meters above the Ukrainian countryside. Fragments rained harmlessly over frozen fields. He exhaled, alive again. But the mission wasn't over. His bombs were still in flight. And now came the worst part. The only way home was west, back through the same drone swarm he had barely escaped. The deconflicted corridor didn't exist anymore. He dropped back to 40 meters and accelerated west. 15 kilometers behind him, 2 French AASM Hammer bombs were fighting their own battle. Their rocket motors burned for approximately 15 seconds, pushing them along a ballistic arc toward the bridge. Each weapon carried 250 kilograms of explosive and was designed to strike precisely. Under ideal conditions, GPS guidance allowed the AASM to hit within 1 meter, but Picrosk was not ideal. The R-330 Zetal electronic warfare stations blanketing the sector had been jamming satellite navigation for months. JDAMER kits drifted off target. GPS-guided artillery missed by dozens of meters. Drone navigation systems failed outright. Inside each bomb, hardened military GPS receivers struggled for signal. They were built for contested electromagnetic environments, but resistance is not immunity. Position errors began accumulating. Centimeters at first, then meters. The bomb's onboard computers recognized degradation and transitioned to inertial navigation. At the heart of each guidance package, ring laser gyroscopes had been measuring acceleration since before release. Using physics alone, they calculated position. No satellites required. The trade-off was accuracy. With GPS, 1 meter. On inertial navigation alone, roughly 10 meters. Still lethal, but no longer guaranteed. The difference between a direct hit and a near miss was now almost a coin toss, and the pilot faced similar odds. He was re-entering the drone swarm. The sky ahead was still layered in chaos. Russian strike FPVs, Ukrainian interceptors, patterns that made no sense. Radio still cutting in and out. He couldn't climb again. The Buk had already proven it could track him. He didn't have the fuel for another afterburner sprint. The only option was straight, low, fast. He steadied the stick. Behind him, 2 French bombs were closing in on the Picrosk Bridge. Ahead of him, the swarm waited, and neither battle was decided yet. He stayed at 40 meters. No climb, no heroics, just straight, low, and fast. At 900 kilometers per hour, he was covering 250 meters every second. A drone appearing 500 meters ahead gave him 2 seconds of warning. 2 seconds to see it, process it, react. That wasn't enough. The FPVs were still there. Russian strike platforms moving west. Ukrainian interceptors moving east. Chaos layered on chaos, each side adding more objects into an airspace already saturated beyond doctrine. His N019 radar remained useless. It was designed to track fighter-sized returns, not 30-centimeter drones made of plastic and lithium batteries. Their radar cross-section was almost non-existent. His infrared search and track system offered nothing. Cold plastic bodies, minimal heat signatures, invisible to sensors built for jet engines. Every instrument in the cockpit belonged to a previous generation of warfare. Only his eyes mattered now, and his eyes were human. A dark speck crossed left to right at maybe 100 meters. Another skimmed the frozen fields below. He didn't maneuver. He couldn't. Any abrupt turn at this altitude and speed risked controlled flight into terrain. Any climb exposed him to radar. Any slowdown increased collision risk. So he flew through them. The radio crackled again, clearer now as he approached Ukrainian-controlled airspace. Impact 30 seconds. Track nominal. The bombs were still flying. 15 kilometers behind him, the AASM Hammers were approaching terminal phase. Their rocket motors had burned out after roughly 15 seconds, accelerating them to Mach 08 before coasting along a ballistic arc toward the eastern span of the Picrosk Bridge. Inside each bomb, the guidance package was doing math in silence. The R-330 Zetal jamming stations continued flooding the sector with electromagnetic interference. Military GPS receivers inside the bombs strained for usable signal. Position solutions degraded further. Without GPS correction, inertial drift increased, from 1 meter accuracy to approximately 10 meters. Still lethal, but no longer surgical. The bombs, ring laser gyroscopes, measured acceleration continuously. From release to terminal descent, they relied on physics alone, building a positional model from motion, velocity, and time. No external input, no updates, just pure calculation. And calculation always accumulates error. The pilot knew none of those numbers in real time, but he understood the reality. The jamming that had degraded JDAMER kits and GPS-guided artillery in this sector for months was now working against his own weapons. Behind him, 2 French-designed systems were fighting Russian electronic warfare. Ahead of him, Russian and Ukrainian drones were fighting each other, and he was flying through both wars at once. 20 seconds to impact. An FPV appeared directly ahead, 50 meters, maybe less, crossing right to left. He made a micro-correction, instinctive, almost subconscious. It was too late to matter. The drone was already behind him before his control input completed. He was still flying, still intact. 10 seconds, drone density began thinning as he pushed farther west, jamming weaker on this side of the line, radio clearer. Roadrunner 24, impact imminent, standby for BDA. 5 seconds. He crossed into Ukrainian-controlled airspace at 6:17 local time. He didn't look back. He was 20 kilometers west of the bridge, racing home at roughly 800 kilometers per hour now. Fuel state amber, hands steady, heart hammering. Then he heard it. Impact, impact. 15 kilometers behind him, 2 AASM Hammers struck within half a second of each other. The first penetrated approximately 18 inches of concrete before detonation. The warhead shattered internal support structures of the eastern span. The second arrived moments later. It struck a section already destabilized, finishing the collapse. Concrete fractured, steel supports failed. The Picrosk Bridge, used by Russian forces as a covered assembly point for 3 weeks of assaults, dropped into the frozen river below. The pilot exhaled. Mission accomplished. But survival was not yet guaranteed. He was not in a sterile sky. The swarm was still active. His fuel was limited. The Buk battery still existed. The Giran drones were still loitering somewhere above. And every kilometer home was still contested. The bridge was gone. Now he just had to make sure he wasn't next. The bridge was gone, but the sky wasn't safe. He stayed low, 40 meters. Maximum dry power, no afterburner this time. Fuel state was amber and he needed every kilogram to get home. The drone density was thinning but not gone. A shape flickered in his peripheral vision, then another. He tracked them with disciplined calm. No sudden movements, no aggressive banking, just controlled, steady flight. At 900 kilometers per hour, panic kills faster than missiles. Behind him, debris from the Picrosk Bridge was still settling into the frozen river. Russian forces had used that structure for 3 weeks as a covered assembly point before launching assaults. Vehicles, troops, staging movement. Now it was concrete and steel in the water. The destruction wasn't symbolic, it was tactical. The eastern span had been structurally shattered. 18 inches of reinforced concrete penetrated before detonation. Support structure compromised. Follow-up strike exploiting that damage within half a second. That timing wasn't luck. It was physics and programming. The AASM Hammer had done exactly what it was designed to do. Even under heavy R-330 Zetal jamming, even with degraded GPS, even operating primarily on inertial navigation with roughly 10-meter accuracy instead of 1. The difference between a direct hit and a near miss had been close to 50-50. Today, the math favored Ukraine, but the pilot wasn't thinking about probabilities. He was thinking about altitude, about trees, about wires, about drones. His radio stabilized further as he moved deeper into Ukrainian-controlled airspace. Roadrunner 24, BDA confirmed structural collapse, eastern span down. Confirmation. The bombs had not drifted wide. They had not been pulled off course by jamming. The ring laser gyroscopes had held their solution long enough. The bridge was no longer usable. He adjusted heading slightly west-southwest, aligning with friendly rear areas. His RWR was quieter now. No Buk illumination. No S-300 search pattern spiking. The Fire Dome radar that had tracked him to 4,000 meters earlier was no longer relevant, but the lesson remained. Climbing had almost killed him. Staying low had almost killed him. Every altitude band carried a different threat. Between 20 and 50 meters, FPV drones and fiber optic cables thin as spider silk. Between 100 and 300 meters, reconnaissance drones and air-to-air ambush platforms like the Giran 2 armed with R-60 infrared missiles. Above that, Buk M3 batteries firing 9 M317M semi-active radar homing missiles at Mach 4. There was no safe layer, only trade-offs. He crossed fully into uncontested airspace. Speed down to 750 kilometers per hour. Engine steady, fuel low but sufficient. His breathing finally slowed. 5 minutes earlier, he had been betting his life on a math problem, whether he could drop below the radar horizon 1 second before a Mach 4 missile reached him. Now he was betting it on distance. Every kilometer west increased survivability. He replayed the sequence in his mind. The first launch warning, a single sharp tone, no radar sweep, no search pulse, the Giran 2 drones, the R-60 infrared missile fired without radar cue. That was new. Russia had turned reconnaissance drones into air-to-air ambush platforms. Heat-seeking missiles dropped from loitering drones in airspace saturated with FPVs. Traditional radar warning receivers could not detect that launch. Air combat assumptions were shifting. Then the Buk engagement. The 9 M317M closing at roughly 1,400 meters per second. Semi-active guidance, dependent on continuous illumination from the Fire Dome radar. Break illumination, break the missile. But breaking illumination required perfect terrain masking geometry under extreme time pressure. The margin had been 1 second, maybe less. And then the final layer, electronic warfare. The R-330 Zetal stations degrading satellite navigation across the sector. JDAMER kits drifting. Artillery missing by dozens of meters, precision munitions fighting for signal, the AASM Hammer adapting by switching to inertial navigation, ring laser gyroscopes calculating position based purely on acceleration and physics, precision reduced from 1 meter to roughly 10, still lethal, still decisive. He realized something as the runway at his base came into view. This mission wasn't just about destroying a bridge, it was a demonstration. Airspace that once belonged to fast jets now belonged to drones. Low altitude meant fiber wires and FPV swarms. Medium altitude meant infrared ambush drones. High altitude meant radar-guided surface-to-air missiles. Electronic warfare blanketed all of it, every layer contested, every layer lethal. And yet the bridge was gone because adaptation had beaten saturation. He lowered the landing gear, throttle eased back, touchdown smooth despite everything that had happened in the last 5 minutes. As he taxied off the runway, ground crews waited. Intelligence officers waited. They would want timelines, threat bearings, drone densities, radar lock durations. They would study the engagement, because what happened at 6:12 local time was not an isolated event. It was a preview. Russian forces had weaponized drones for air-to-air ambush. Ukraine had proven that even under heavy jamming, precision weapons could still function using inertial systems. And a MiG-29 pilot had threaded through the most drone-saturated airspace in human history at 900 kilometers per hour, evaded 2 R-60 infrared missiles, survived a 9 M3 17M Mach 4 intercept attempt, and destroyed a bridge that had supported 3 weeks of assaults. One mission, multiple wars happening simultaneously in the same sky. The rules of air combat are changing, and anyone who ignores that shift will not survive it. Subscribe for more military insights, tech breakdowns, and updates.